Welcome to the Leadmore podcast. I'm your host, John T. Meyer. The Leadmore podcast is the show where we sit down with leaders of today to help inspire and create more leaders for tomorrow. I believe the world needs more leaders. I also believe that leadership doesn't always look the way we think it does. And it's important to, give the microphone, per se, literally in this case, to other leaders. And that's what we're doing in this episode with Wendy Mamer. Wendy is the Assistant Director of Admissions at Augustana University. She is also an incredible public speaker and gave a TED Talk last fall, September 2020, during the pandemic, about the topic of mental illness. It has over 50,000 views at this time and growing. She is an advocate about mental illness and mental health and has a very, very personal story about how that topic has affected her family and her life. And so I'm going to let her tell that story. But Wendy is a powerful advocate in our community here in Sioux Falls and in the state of South Dakota, and a young up-and-coming leader who I expect, when we look back at this episode in years to come, will be doing, and already is, big things. So with that, on this episode of the Leadmore podcast, let's take a listen to Wendy Mamer. All right, welcome to another episode of the Leadmore podcast. I'm really excited for today's conversation. When you have just several people in your life who keep telling you need to talk to this person, we reached out and said we need to talk. So welcome Wendy Mamer to the show. How are you, Wendy?
Thank you. I'm doing well. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, so you are the Assistant Director of Admissions at Augustana University. You went there for a little bit of time, right?
Yep.
You started there?
Yep, 2 years.
2 years, finished at, what'd you say, Southwest?
Yep, Southwest Minnesota State University in Marshall.
Okay, and you've been at Augie for about 3.5 years?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, I love it.
And what do you love about it?
I get to interact with powerful leaders, youth in our community, from southern Minnesota to from really all across the United States, and help them navigate that college search process that is a lot of times overwhelming. But in the meantime, get to know them and their story and connect with them. And that's ultimately my favorite thing to do, is connect in people and get to know them.
Yeah. Can you tell when a student is on campus, like whether or not they're going to come to that school?
Sometimes. I feel like there is a fairly good instinct. Sometimes I don't want to believe it if it's the answer is no, but I feel like I do at this point, having been there 3.5 years, have a fairly good read on students.
Because I remember when, the counselor at Brookings High School, or people telling you, like, it's just kind of a feeling, like a gut, right? You'll have like a vibe when you go to campus. And I remember being like, starting to look and be like, how do I know, right? How will I know? And of course, I swore I was not going to go to the school that my brother went to, and then ultimately got that vibe and ended up going there. But
that is hilarious. My mom is an Augustana alum.
Okay.
And I always swore I would absolutely never go there. And I visited campus to kind of get her to stop talking about the fact that I should visit campus.
Like, check the box.
Yep. And I went there and got that same feeling, this feeling that I talk about with students that they'll get when they know they're in the right place. And so it's exactly what it is, the feeling.
I think I've read somewhere in your bio, or like part of your goal is to help make a more diverse set of student body at Augustana University. Why is that important to you?
Yeah, I think that when we have a room or a university or spaces that are full of diversity, that is where we learn the best, is learning from each other. Obviously, there's a lot of learning to be done through textbooks, but learning from the people around you, I think, is equally as important. And the more diverse that room is, or that space is, the more you'll learn. Yeah,
that's great. And you have your own story in that chapter. So you grew up on a farm in rural Minnesota.
Yes.
But you were born in Guatemala, correct?
Yes, I was born in Escuintla, Guatemala, and I was adopted when I was 4.5, 5-ish months old.
Okay.
Actually, it will be 27 years tomorrow that I was brought to the United States.
Wow, crazy. And have other adopted siblings, right?
Yep, 2 brothers and a sister, and we were all adopted. My parents are very selfless people.
That's amazing.
So,
have you been back to your hometown?
I have not, actually.
Okay.
Yep, that is something that in the future I would definitely like to do.
Cool. So you grew up in Minnesota on a farm, right?
Yes, I'm a farm girl. Most people would never guess that, but I am.
That's great. your parents were big into theater, right?
Yes.
But you decided to go the other way?
Yes, I regretfully look back on it now, wishing that I had definitely been involved in theater. I feel like a lot of my friend group now is heavily involved in the local theater scene. But yeah, I played sports. I was in basketball and track, and then I played volleyball really early on for a short stint of time. But basketball was my favorite.
Cool. And that's good little context. And I learned all of these things. I will say we'll move into this topic next from watching your TED Talk. You gave a TED Talk in September of 2020, during last fall. It is incredible. It's very. I had tears in my eyes watching it, and it says sort of as prep for this conversation.
Yeah.
So I don't really want to like take the storyline. So how about you tell us a little bit about giving that talk and what the talk was about?
Yeah. So it was definitely more overwhelming than I thought it was going to be. So it was a couple of years before I applied for TEDx that my dad ended up dying by suicide. And I'd always been a very strong mental health advocate through his struggles, trying to normalize conversations surrounding depression and anxiety and how it's a lot more prevalent than we realize. And so I did my best to be vulnerable in hopes that it would help other people and connect us to other people, and also just to understand what he was going through, and just how to best approach the situation and almost to normalize it, so it wasn't like he was part of the stigma that people created about using the words crazy and insane and different things like that, that just like it can happen to anybody. And this is proof that my dad, who was a very successful farmer, really ended up struggling with diagnosable mental illnesses. And so after my dad passed away, I'd shared my story or pieces of it via social media. And every time I would share something, I feel like I got a really overwhelming response back of people who felt like their feelings were finally put into words. Even though our stories were different, there's a lot of commonality amongst people and the feelings and the heartache that we go through. And so I found that when I was sharing it, people were really relating to it. And so I was like, how can I share this on a bigger stage? And one of my dear friends actually was also applying and had encouraged me to apply, Jade from Lemonly. And so I went through the application process and ended up being selected. And so after I was selected, I was like, okay, now I have to write this. And it was during the pandemic, and so that made things a little bit more difficult. It was originally supposed to be in March, I believe. But the date kept on getting pushed back. And so that made it more difficult for me to actually sit down and write it, because I was having a little bit of writer's block, as well as not wanting to maybe go as deep as I thought that I should. And so in the process of preparing, we would all get together and kind of share what we had written and the progress we were making on our TED Talks. And it was with the other people who were also selected for TEDx Sioux Falls that year. And after my first couple sessions, I actually was getting some pretty harsh feedback that I really wasn't sure how to take, because I was more so focusing on my story and the story from my perspective. And I was very much challenged to focus on my dad's story. And I really struggled with that because, first of all, my initial thought was, this is my story to tell. And I feel like that's what would be most relatable. But then eventually they were like, I think it would be most relatable if you told your dad's story. And so I really struggled with that. And then eventually I brought it up in counseling. My counselor is the most amazing person in the entire world. And so I ended up talking with her about it. And she's like, Wendy, I think they're right. And she is just someone I trust so much. And so then I was like, oh, okay. And so the person who is giving me this feedback, Bonnie Hariri, amazing.
Oh, yeah. Former guest of the show.
Yes, love that. He said, Wendy, if you need help one-on-one outside of these group practices, let me know and I'd be willing to meet with you. So he really extended that olive branch there, which I'll forever be grateful for, because that's, I think, what really challenged me to get my talk to the point that it was when I delivered it. And so after I had counseling, I'd scheduled a meeting with Bonnie for a Sunday evening, and I did evening because I am the ultimate procrastinator and I do my best work really under pressure.
Sure. Yeah, I can relate to that. Yep.
That Sunday morning, I woke up and had a meeting with Bonnie that afternoon, and I had not started. And so I was like, you know what? This is it. I'm just going to sit down and write it.
Yeah.
And I woke up early and I wrote for probably 7.5 hours.
Wow.
And when I finished it, I was like, this is it. Like, this is something that I am very proud of and that I'll stand by and that I feel confident speaking to all of the world, because it's on the internet so everybody can see it. And so I was really confident in that. And I said to myself, if Bonnie doesn't like this, then I'm just not going to do it because I just felt that good about it.
Well, I think you can, your dad would have been very proud. You know, you said you didn't, you wish you would have done theater, but you certainly gave that talk as a veteran. Like, it was clearly that you were well rehearsed. You hit all your points, especially in a very vulnerable, obviously clearly emotional topic.
Yes.
And I saw it this morning when I watched it. It has almost 50,000 views on the internet. And that's the beauty of the internet in a platform like that.
Yeah.
The people that it reached, I even saw, you alluded to it in your talk, but also in the comments, which is something I never even considered about, that mental illness, mental health is an issue for everyone.
Yes.
But I had never thought about agriculture, maybe in particular, and farmers. It's an incredibly challenging industry, career.
And that is something that was so important to me, was to really highlight his career in farming and agriculture, just because, especially in the Midwest, we live in such a heavily dominated rural farming,
we all know a farmer,
ranching.
Or, somebody who grew up on one farm. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. We just live in a space that is a very dominated career field. And so when I started talking about it initially, when my dad was struggling, we would have, and I talk about this in my TED Talk, but other farmers' wives would say, I think my husband's going through that too, actually.
Wow. Yeah.
And so once I got that initial feedback, then it was really important to me to highlight that aspect of it, just to bring awareness to it, because I think it's not something that a lot of people realize.
Yeah. What do you think about, do you feel like when you gave the talk, I wonder if there was any timing there, just in the middle of a pandemic, right? Certainly mental illness was an issue prior, but we've read a lot of articles that some of the challenges of the pandemic, we may don't even fully know yet or understand, sort of the second or third order effects from the pandemic, and certainly mental health is probably one of them.
Yeah, and that is something that I really try to advocate for, in the fact that the pandemic and mental illness, mental illness has existed far beyond, we've been in a mental health crisis for a long time, even before the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And the pandemic just really exacerbated that. And it really has shown the inadequacy that we have in our mental health services. And it's really bringing out the growing need that we have in services for all ages, and especially youth, and in the school districts too, just because it has posed challenges that were very unexpected, and that I don't believe the mental health ecosystem has enough to support right now.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's talk about that. What do we do, right? So I feel like it at least has been more openly discussed, thanks to folks like you. I think about what Simone Biles did during the Olympics this summer. It seems to be maybe getting more normalized, and you certainly talked about, you used that word in your talk and talked about moving away from words like crazy, but but then what, right? Like, what's the now what? Like, okay, now we're having the conversation, but how do we get down into like the schools or to where do we go from here?
Yeah. And this is always a tricky question. And I feel like anytime I have a platform to talk about mental health awareness and advocacy, I always do like to point out that I am not a mental health professional and that lived experience is how I advocate from, and that's the space I advocate from. But I also do think that from what I've learned is that we need to create a more proactive versus reactive culture in terms of mental health, mental illness, death by suicide. I think when we're so reactive whenever a suicide happens or whenever I just read in the Brookings paper, there's been a string of overdoses.
Ask you about that. Yeah, they had to talk about, gosh, it was like, I'm from Brookings, so it was scary the amount of, I think it said about 23% of kids have attempted suicide, 1 in 4.
Yes. And so we look at those numbers and then it's immediately, okay, we have to do something about this. But really, we need to start right now creating long-term plans that hopefully end up leading to solutions far down the road, but really start thinking proactively instead of just reactively when a tragedy happens. We need to be prepared for tragedy and have a recovery plan after. And I think a lot of that also stems from education. Yeah. Yep. I mean, we have health class and we talk about our physical health.
The health wellness wheel, whatever, yeah.
We do jump rope for heart, to raise awareness for heart disease. But really what affects these students in elementary school, middle school, high school is mental health. That is something that everybody has, is mental health. And so how can we be proactive and encouraging, maintaining healthy habits versus maintaining or figuring out ways to get ourselves out of those slumps?
I think, growing up and going through middle school and navigating the social circles of friendship and learning and family is hard enough. And you and I didn't even have to do it with, social media. And sort of this measuring stick of someone else's life and comparing yourself and all that mess that brings as well.
Yeah. For sure.
I've always been an advocate of like that's not the right way to say it, but I've always kind of bought into the phrase that like health is wealth, and I think we've really seen that exposed this past 18, 20 months with the pandemic. If your health is off, it really just eliminates your ability to be a functioning contributor, the society, a family member, an employee, a father, a friend, all these things. But that doesn't just mean, physical health, right? And I think you hit that on your talk when you talked about this is like a chemical imbalance. This isn't like, well, he, must have done something wrong or he was like hanging out with the wrong people, right? This is much more than that.
Yeah, it's just, there's so much that goes into it. It's such a complex disease that we are starting to really make progress on in terms of creating conversation and creating awareness. But there's also still a long ways to go. And I think it's very, like I said, very complex, so many factors that go into it. And it can truly happen to absolutely anybody. I mean, my dad was a very physically healthy person. But it's just when your brain starts working against you, it becomes a very much an active fight for peace of mind every single day. And that's just really, really hard to watch someone you love so much go through.
Yeah. And so if someone's listening to this and they might think, oh gosh, thank God I don't have to deal with that, right? Like I feel like my brain is aligned with my body. But you said a really important line in your talk that even if you don't have mental illness, you do have mental health.
Yeah.
And help maybe like distinguish those two things.
Yeah. So I think kind of like what we've talked about, just like physical health, we all have mental health. And it's kind of confusing because a lot of times people get sadness confused with depression, and there's a very distinguishable difference between those two. And so the language we use is very important when talking about this. But really, mental health is something that you have to, like I said, maintain, because in life is going to throw all of us curveballs. And kind of like I've said in my TED Talk is that we are all more alike than we are different. We will all feel deep pain throughout our lives. We'll all feel lonely, and we will all have times that we're really struggling or not feeling our best, and that's our mental health. That's when our mental health comes into play. And so, first of all, just being aware that we have it,
that's great.
Is something that we just all need to admit to ourselves, and in order to take care of it, right? We have to acknowledge that it's there in order to be actively being mindful of it. And so once we admit that we have mental health, then we can focus on, okay, now how do I take care of it? And there's a bunch of different ways, and it looks different for everybody. Yeah. Not everybody is going to respond well to counseling, but maybe even being active is a great way to take care of your mental health.
Certainly interlinked, yeah.
Yes, having hobbies, having a purpose outside of your career, things like that really are good ways to take care of our mental health. And even if you do have mental illness, like I said, you do have mental health. And so acknowledging that we have it and then making it a priority to take care of it are two very important things.
Yeah. I always think it's, Lemonly, our job is to design clarity. And I always think it's important to sort of break down things that are big and complicated, like mental health, into little tangible examples.
Yeah.
And you gave one in your talk, which was just like, what do you say when someone walks by and says, "Hey, how are you?" And 99% of us say, "Good."
Yeah.
Great. How are you?
Yeah.
When maybe we actually aren't.
Yeah.
So, what should someone say? How they're actually feeling?
Yeah. So, and this is where it becomes a little tricky. So one thing, how I handle this is I try not to ask that, because a lot of times people aren't necessarily. Nobody's ready to hear the actual truth if it's anything but,
if you're just
I'm doing well.
At the water cooler at work. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what are questions that we can ask beyond that, or compliments that we can give that don't necessarily have to do with physical appearance, And so just kind of maybe straying away from that question unless you're really, truly ready to be prepared for a heavy answer. Because I think that's something that we should all be prepared. If we ask that question, we need to be prepared to have a response to any possible answer. So that's something I try to focus on. I definitely slip up on it all the time, just because it's
so ingrained in
it's like tendency.
Human interaction for sure.
Yep.
I love that idea of like the compliments beyond physical. I feel like we've talked about this on the show, that everyone needs somebody to believe in them, maybe often even more than they believe in themselves. Yeah. And those people who nudge in your life, or those people who just say like, "Great work, Wendy, like keep going, like that was awesome." That goes a long way.
Yeah, for sure.
Another one you hit on, which I could definitely relate to, was this idea that, do you find that a lot of your self-worth is in your work? Probably like yourself. I'm a ambitious, like motivated person, right? Yeah. I started a company. I was CEO of a company, have a family. But some days I always think, gosh, it's a lot easier. I feel like I'm better at being a CEO than I am at being a dad. Yeah. Right? Like kids are complicated, they're changing, they're unpredictable, and I'm still fairly new at it. Whereas like I've been doing this work thing for a while. And so it is easy to kind of grade yourself by your work.
Yep. Yeah. And that is something I definitely struggle with too. I can talk about it in my TED Talk and acknowledge that it is a concern, but it's also something that I very much struggle with as well. I think for a lot of people, work is something that, although every day can be a little bit different, it's something that you at least kind of somewhat know what to expect. But also at the same time, when you know what to expect and you know what you should be doing, when you don't meet that, that's when it can be a little disappointing. When there's gray area, when there's that ambiguity, I think that's what makes it a little bit more difficult. But like I said, it's something that I definitely struggle with, and I think that's why it's good to have hobbies outside of your everyday work that you do. And also it's important to create those boundaries as well, because when you bring your work home with you, or working at 60, 80 hours a week, I think then that work becomes your life. And that's a dangerous path to go down. And kind of like what I talk about in my TED Talk specifically with farming. I mean, it becomes an identity.
14 hours a day.
Yeah. And that is just an unhealthy place to be.
Yeah. We, early on last summer, we had a guest talk about remote work when we were all working remotely in the pandemic, and many of us still are. And she had a great tip, which was have a kind of a unwind routine at the end of your day. So part of it is a lot of these boundaries have been blurred, right? Like we're working at the dining room table, which then an hour later becomes the dining room table. And so this idea of having this kind of routine that I am logging off, I'm shutting my computer down, I'm maybe putting my phone away, and now I'm going back to my life as, a dad and a husband. Or I thought that was really good. And I also love your point about hobbies. And I would even say hobbies that are maybe offline, right? I was encouraged. I heard that in Sioux Falls, the community ed courses are really making a big comeback. And very popular right now. So everything from I'm going to learn how to knit, or I'm going to learn how to garden, or I just thought that was really interesting.
If they have how to learn how to cook, I should probably attend something like that.
So your husband's the chef in the family? Okay.
Yeah, I'm the worst. The worst.
Well, let's do one more big one, and then we'll do a little bit of rapid fire to get to know you a little more.
Yeah.
So it's almost 2022. You've had a diverse set of experiences in your career, both professionally and personally, as we discussed. So let's say we're closing out the decade at 2030. What's your hope for mental health in our country? What could it look like that would put us in a better spot?
Yeah, well, I hope that the conversation just keeps progressing and going deeper into mental health and mental illness, so we can really normalize the conversations. And so those who are struggling with diagnosable mental illnesses don't feel so alone. I think right now where we're at, we're really starting to see depression and anxiety become normalized, but there are so many other severe mental health disorders that I think are almost scary for people to acknowledge or talk about. And even more so be around when
So when we dive in, there's more, it's multi-layered, and there's different avenues, and it's complicated.
And different levels of severity. And I think we're kind of just scratching the surface right now of what's comfortable to talk about, because maybe those are the most commonly diagnosed mental illnesses with, I don't want to say less severe side effects, because I never want to downplay that. But
just
there are
different experiences,
there are certainly other mental illnesses out there that don't necessarily get the same conversations, that depression and anxiety do. And so I think as time goes on, I'd really like to see that conversation deepen and include other mental illnesses that millions of people suffer with in our country, and how we can best respond to situations like that, situations of crisis, and just be overall better citizens and better neighbors, because a lot of people are struggling with things that we just don't have a good understanding of yet. And I just expanding of the services too, and having the right people be the ones in the situations that are responding to mental health crisis. So focusing more on social workers and mental health professionals versus police responding to situations, and then having the person in crisis end up going to jails. That's not what's going to help. Having adequate numbers of school counselors in our school districts that can really address behavior issues. I feel like a lot of times we look at naughty kids, right? And we just see the initial behavior on the outside, and we don't ask, okay, what is leading to this behavior? Because I previously worked in psychiatric residential treatment for youth ages 11 to 17. And so I really saw the levels of trauma and how that came out in their behaviors that I think we don't realize. We just see what's on the outside. Okay, they're being naughty, but what is the environment that they're coming from that is leading to those behaviors? And so I think that's why it's so important that we have adequate school counselors in our school districts, because it's unfair for teachers to be held responsible for working through that behavior because they just don't have
and
time.
then they're not learning anything if they can't mentally be, present and aware. Yeah.
And so really just working towards continuing the conversation, going even deeper into different mental illnesses, but then also finding ways to make sure that we have adequate resources available, especially like we said, this pandemic is really exacerbating kind of the holes in the system. And so we really need to focus on that moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. In so many ways, right? Everything from like the supply chain to our mental health, the pandemic really has exposed some of these things.
Yeah.
I guess I lied. I'll have one more. So do you, you mentioned, I think you're very clear that like you come from this space as someone through lived experience as an advocate, not as like a mental health professional. But we also started the show, you talked a lot about, loving your job in admissions and at Augustana University. Is this a path you see yourself going down professionally, or just continuing to be more of an advocate and speak to it?
Yeah, that is a great question, one I ask myself all the time. I think right now my role at Augustana has really allowed me to bring my advocacy work into what I'm doing. As we talked about, everyone has mental health, and that transition to college is is so difficult. And so I've really been able to kind of normalize the hardships that come along with the college transition, and so that has been really, really great. And ultimately, kind of like you said, I don't have a formal title when it comes to mental health advocacy. I'm not leading a nonprofit focused on mental health. I don't have an advanced degree in counseling. But I think my leadership at Augustana and within the mental health field is a lot of just showing up. And it's quiet leadership, it's loud leadership, whether I'm advocating on the TEDx stage or a student texts me and they're really struggling and I'm meeting them for lunch, or showing up at the suicide prevention walk. It's just really just showing up. And whether that's quiet, whether that's loud, I work right now at Augustana University, and I'm so proud that they allow me to have that flexibility to bring such an important part of me to my work. And so as it stands right now, I love Augustana. I love the students I work with. So I don't see myself necessarily leaving there anytime soon to pursue a career in the mental health field, but it's definitely something that I think about often is getting that advanced degree, so then I can have more credentials behind my name in my advocacy.
Well, it sounds like you're doing both, and certainly we know we need more people doing this, so like you're playing your role for sure. So great work on that.
Thank you.
Okay, a little bit just to get to know you. I don't know if you're a reader, but a question we always ask, is there a book that you recommend or give to people most often?
I really like the book Radical Candor by Ken Scott, because
also a former guest of the show.
Oh my gosh, amazing.
Yeah.
Because I am such a believer in transparency and honesty in all types of in every single relationship. And I think Radical Candor really teaches you the balance between empathy and aggression, assertiveness. And so
I heard a little chart. It's about caring deeply but challenge directly.
Yes. Yep. And I really that is something that I hope to fully embody by the end of my leadership journey, is just that. When my favorite compliment is when people tell me, I appreciate your candor.
Nice.
So that is, something I really strive for, and that I would like to be known
for.
Great.
That's great. I love that. And I agree. I love that book. Made all my managers read that book.
Love it.
We talked about hobbies. So the way I usually phrase it is, how do you unplug when leaders have a lot to bear, and we are talking about mental health, but we're also talking about hobbies. So how do you unplug?
Yeah. So I really enjoy being active. So go to the gym. I try to 3 or 4 mornings a week. Mornings are hard for me. But I also really love public speaking. It is one of my favorite things in the world. So I also MC for the Sioux Falls Skyforce.
Oh, yes. Someone told me this. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Which, that makes sense. You got the basketball.
Yes. I love sports. And so I love going to Augustana athletic events.
So you're like a hype students, woman. You're like, let's get pumped up.
Yes. I love that. I love
super cheesy, like over the top.
I wouldn't say I'm cheesy, but I mean, I guess I probably can be sometimes. But yeah, I just try to, I don't know, bring a type of energy that I bring to most spaces I enter.
Sure.
I'm always just super hyper and
Love it.
energetic. So yeah, I really do enjoy that. I've gotten to know the season ticket holders super well.
Sure.
So those relationships are really special to me.
Do you have like a tagline yet? Do you have like a thing that you say that you've made your own?
No.
Okay,
And I've done it. This is my 5th year now, so I should probably figure it out.
I didn't know that. Okay. Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, you need like a sports center, like a booyah or something like that. Like
no kidding. And I have two puppies. So
nice.
I have to throw that in there.
Perfect.
I love spending time with them.
Love it. So we asked this question. I have a few guesses, but we asked this question when we hire at Lemonly, which is, what do you think, Wendy, is your superpower? The thing that you do best?
Yeah. I think my superpower is my vulnerability. I think I have a gift at putting into words the complex emotions and feelings and situations that we all go through. And by doing that, I feel like it allows people to connect through shared experiences that they didn't really realize they had because they didn't know how to put it into words.
That's good.
And so I think that that is something that I do well and will always continue to do to help make people feel less alone.
I'd probably agree with that. And it's definitely on display in your TED Talk. We'll make sure to link that in the show notes so people can see that.
Thank you.
The last question we always ask helps understand, I think, where leaders come from, but who are the leaders who have inspired you? So whether you know them, friends, family, teachers, coaches, or people you've studied.
Yes. So the woman that I look up to most in South Dakota, Kelsey Sutton, I think she is just a trailblazer for women. She is vulnerable, she is honest, and she is someone that I really, really look up to.
Cool.
But with my job at Augustana, I would be so wrong not to mention the students that I look up to. Specifically, Sagab Arega, Makai Moore. They are 2 current students at Augustana that are just working so hard every single day to make Augustana a more inclusive and diverse place. And the work that they've done, the changes that I've seen throughout my time with them there, I learn from them all the time. And so those are the 2 Augustana students. And then there are some just powerful leaders in the Sioux Falls School District right now. Antoinette, Susanna, Zuhaira, Faith, just a few names that come to mind of they are change makers now. And I think leadership and learning is so intergenerational that it's not an age hierarchy. It's not top down. It is, we need to learn from the youth in our communities as well because they have so much to teach us.
I love that. Well, you mentioned, Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor. When I asked her that question, I mean, she has reported to and worked for, Steve Jobs and, Sheryl Sandberg, when she was at Google. Some of the biggest names in business. And her answer was, it is not those people. It was the people that have worked for her, right? That those are the people that have made her a better leader. And I thought that was an incredible answer. And very similar to your answer with the students, right? Who are pushing you to be better in the school and all that. So
they make me want to be better, and every single day, I learned so much from them.
That's great. Well, this was an awesome discussion, and I thank you for sharing, for being vulnerable, your superpower, and for coming on the show. So thanks for being here, Wendy.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Take care. Okay, thank you, Wendy, for your time, for coming on in this conversation, and for being vulnerable, not just on this show, but on your TED Talk and everywhere you go to spread this important message. Thank you, listeners, for listening to the show. As always, we drop new episodes every Thursday of the Leadmore podcast. I encourage you to subscribe. If you're on Apple, click subscribe. If you're on Spotify, click follow. Send an episode of one of your favorite episodes. Send it to a friend. You can click, you can tweet, you can share. All the great things. We just love to have different people find this show and discover this show. And I thank you for listening. As always, take care and be well.